In 1946, the United States meticulously prosecuted Nazi doctors at Nuremberg, hanging them for the crime of human experimentation.
Right.
Yet at the exact same moment, on the other side of the world, the U.S. government was quietly handing envelopes of cash to Japanese doctors who had committed the exact same atrocities.
And in many ways at an even larger, more industrialized scale.
Exactly. So today's deep dive examines why.
We are opening a door that was deliberately bolted shut by multiple global powers for decades. You are about to hear a synthesis of newly declassified 2025 Russian archives, previously buried historical records, and rigorous psychological analyses.
And I want to be very clear about our mission today. We're here to document Unit 731, the Imperial Japanese Army's covert biological warfare research division during World War II.
Yes, we are looking squarely at the darkest depths of the industrialization of cruelty. Our focus will be divided between two inextricably linked mechanisms. First, the calculated mechanical scale of these operations.
Right, the logistics of it.
And second, the profound ethical collapse that allowed sworn medical doctors to become architects of mass death. We will also examine the subsequent global cover-up that traded human justice for biological data.
You need to prepare yourself for an unflinching look at this history. Understanding these atrocities in their unvarnished reality, detailing exactly how they were engineered, well, it's the only way to ensure the mechanisms that allowed them to happen are never replicated.
It is entirely necessary.
So to understand how a nation decides to industrialize biological warfare, you really have to look at the strategic vacuum following the First World War.
Right, the aftermath of the trenches.
Exactly. Dr. Shiro Ishii, who was a microbiologist and an army physician, spent 2 years in the late 1920s touring Western medical and military research facilities. He was observing the devastating aftermath of chemical weapons used in Europe.
But his takeaway from that tour was not a desire for peace.
No, not at all. He recognized a chilling loophole regarding the 1925 Geneva Protocol, which, banned biological and chemical warfare.
It is a devastating, entirely inverted piece of logic. The international community, traumatized by mustard gas and chlorine, sought to ban these weapons to prevent unnecessary civilian suffering.
Right.
But the Japanese military high command, driven by Ishii's reporting, viewed this prohibition through a purely militaristic, opportunistic lens.
They saw an opening.
Yes. They reasoned that if Western powers had gone to the immense diplomatic trouble of explicitly banning biological weapons, it must be because those weapons were unparalleled in their effectiveness.
Right. Japan signed the protocol, but notably did not ratify it.
Which created a profound legal and ethical vacuum.
And Ishii argued to his superiors that for an island nation with incredibly limited natural resources, well, biological weapons offered a low-cost, high-yield alternative to conventional artillery and steel.
It's a dark practical calculus.
The timeline of his project's expansion is methodical, reflecting a state fully committing to this vision. The initial phase of research began in 1932 with the establishment of the Togo unit at the Zongma Fortress.
That was a highly fortified prison camp, right?
Yes, about 100 kilometers south of Harbin in Manchuria. But in 1934, there was a prisoner uprising. And then that was followed by an accidental explosion at the facility in 1935, which compromised the absolute secrecy Ishii required.
So he needed something bigger.
He needed something vastly larger and entirely impenetrable. So in 1936, an imperial decree officially authorized the expansion of the unit and its formal integration into the Kwantung Army. They relocated to the Pingfang district of Harbin.
Look at the map for a second. Why Manchuria? You often hear that it was chosen for geographical isolation to keep the extreme dangers of pathogen cultivation far away from the Japanese public on the mainland.
Which makes logistical sense on the surface.
It does, but I have to push back on the idea that this was merely a logistical maneuver. The geography was secondary. Manchuria was chosen because it was a legal black hole.
Right.
They needed a place where human beings had zero legal standing. The Japanese occupied territory offered an unlimited supply of what the researchers coldly referred to as human material?
God, just the phrasing.
I know. This consisted of Chinese civilians, anti-Japanese partisans, Russian prisoners, Koreans, and later on, Allied prisoners of war.
And the supply chain for this material was entirely state-sponsored.
Right.
The Kempeitai, the Japanese military police, functioned as a secret police force.
Right.
They systematically rounded up these individuals and delivered them directly to Pingfang.
Exactly. The political reality of occupied Manchuria created a zone of total exception. The Kempeitai could abduct thousands of people from the streets, from their homes, or from prisoner camps without generating a single paper trail.
Or answering to any judicial authority.
Exactly. You cannot operate a facility like Unit 731 without a state apparatus willing to disappear people on an industrial scale.
Which brings us to the actual scale of what they built at Pingfang. Because we're not talking about a single laboratory building doing theoretical work here.
No, not at all.
This was a massive, hidden facility covering 6 square kilometers. It contained over 150 administrative and laboratory buildings.
It's the size of a small city.
It had its own airport to launch aircraft for field testing. It had a dedicated specialized rail line specifically constructed to transport materials and victims directly into the center of the compound unseen.
And yet, to the outside world, this massive bureaucratic and architectural footprint operated under an official cover. They called it the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army.
A water purification unit.
Right, but inside it was a high-tech slaughterhouse.
Oh.
But, you can build a 6-square-kilometer facility in secret, and you can lay down the rail lines, but you cannot automate the science.
It need actual people.
You need human beings. Highly trained doctors, university professors, and researchers who took the Hippocratic Oath. They had to actually run the daily operations.
So how do you convince thousands of professional healers to execute a biological holocaust without them suffering a collective psychological breakdown? How does that even happen?
To answer that, you have to look at the sheer industrial pressure of the pathogen production. The demands placed on these doctors were staggering.
Unit 731 utilized massive culture tanks and specialized greenhouses, operating constantly at exactly 37 degrees Celsius.
To mimic human body temperature, right?
Exactly. They were capable of producing 300 kilograms of raw, weaponized plague bacteria and up to 1 ton of cholera every single month.
1 ton. Just try to grasp that volume.
It's almost impossible. They had an entire logistical division, casually known as the Rat Unit, dedicated entirely to breeding rodents to serve as hosts for plague-infested fleas. They housed around 4,500 highly controlled flea incubators. They were manufacturing death on an assembly line.
And to operate that assembly line without internal revolt or mass desertion, the staff had to systematically dismantle their own medical ethics. This brings us to the specific mechanisms of their cover story.
Right.
And the deeply disturbing psychological reality of what transpired inside the walls of Pingfang. The local cover story was remarkably mundane. To explain the massive walled-off complex and the constant smoke from the incinerators to the locals in Harbin, the facility was passed off as a lumber mill.
A lumber mill. And because of this specific localized cover story, a horrifying terminology developed inside the laboratories.
It did. The human beings who were brought into the facility were officially and casually referred to by the staff as Maruta.
Which translates directly to logs.
Yes. Guards, researchers, and lab technicians would walk the halls and casually ask one another how many logs fell today when they were checking the daily death toll.
Normally, medicine is a firewall designed to protect the human body from nature's worst designs. But inside Unit 731, those doctors took the firewall and reverse-engineered it into a weapon.
Exactly.
They didn't just study diseases, they studied how to optimize them to dismantle the human body as efficiently as possible. But how does calling someone a log actually bridge the psychological gap between being a doctor and being a murderer? Did they genuinely believe these prisoners were subhuman?
See, if they truly believed the prisoners were biologically subhuman, the data extracted from them would be considered medically useless for weapons development. That is the core psychological contradiction here.
I see.
They needed the victims perfectly, unequivocally human. They needed to study human physiology accurately to develop biological weapons that would effectively kill other humans on the battlefield.
So they knew exactly what they were doing.
The cognitive dissonance comes from knowing entirely well that the subject is a human being, knowing you are violating your fundamental oath to heal, and doing it anyway.
So the language acts as a buffer.
It is a deliberate linguistic tool to resolve extreme psychological discomfort. Calling a human being a log allows a doctor to compartmentalize the action. You aren't dissecting a man, you are processing material.
You aren't killing a mother, you are cutting wood.
Exactly. Furthermore, the newly provided psychological analyses point to a phenomenon known as the body violation factor. Many of these doctors were driven by an intense, morbid curiosity that completely eclipsed their morality.
Just a total detachment from empathy.
Yes. Add to this the intense societal conformity of Imperial Japan. Defying orders from the Kwantung Army meant bringing total societal shame upon one's family. And conversely, these doctors knew this state-sponsored research was highly classified but incredibly valued.
They believed their findings would secure them immense post-war prestige and dominance in the medical field.
Right.
I want you, the listener, to consider the terrifying power of euphemism here. How a single word, Maruta, can systematically dismantle a society's moral barriers. Because once those ethical barriers were entirely removed and the victims were verbally stripped of their humanity, the actual science of cruelty was unleashed inside the compound.
And we have to talk about what that science actually looked like.
We do. The details of the human experimentation at Unit 731 are harrowing, but they must be documented. Let us look at the vivisections. Doctors would deliberately infect prisoners with lethal weaponized pathogens like bubonic plague or cholera. But they didn't just wait for the victims to die. As soon as the very first symptoms appeared, indicating the pathogen was active, the prisoner is taken to a dissection room, strapped to a specialized surgical table, and cut open alive.
And we must emphasize the most gruesome aspect of this procedure. These vivisections were performed completely without anesthesia.
The scientific, twisted logic behind that decision is vital to understanding the mindset of Unit 731. They did not withhold anesthesia simply to be cruel, though it was unimaginably cruel.
Why did they do it then?
They withheld it because the researchers believed that introducing chemical sedatives into the bloodstream would alter the biological data. They believed anesthetics would taint their observation of the disease's pure active effects on living, functioning organs.
It's just a complete perversion of the scientific method.
According to the meticulously recorded data and later testimonies from medical assistants, victims would scream in unimaginable agony until a towel was stuffed into their mouths. And they were methodically dissected, organ by organ, while fully conscious until blood loss resulted in death.
The absolute human cost of these specific procedures is staggering. Official estimates state that at least 3,000 to 10,000 individuals died inside the walls of the Pingfang facility alone.
And that does not even account for the satellite units operating elsewhere.
Right. But the experimentation extended far beyond infectious diseases. We have to look at the frostbite testing conducted by Dr. Yoshimura Hisato.
The context for Hisato's experiments was entirely strategic. The Kwantung Army was actively preparing for a potential massive ground war against the Soviet Union in the freezing, unforgiving climate of Siberia.
So they needed to know how the body reacts to extreme cold.
Yes, but the military high command didn't just want to know how frostbite happened. They were methodically trying to establish the exact mathematical threshold at which human tissue becomes irrecoverable. They wanted to formulate battlefield triage protocols to know precisely when to amputate and when to treat a frozen Japanese soldier.
And to get that data, prisoners were taken outside into the brutal Manchurian winter, where temperatures routinely dropped well below zero. Their limbs were repeatedly doused with freezing water until they froze completely solid.
It's just unthinkable.
The researchers would strike the prisoners' frozen arms and legs with a short wooden stick until the limb emitted a specific hollow sound, like a wooden board being struck.
God.
That sound was their metric for total, deep tissue freezing. Once that baseline was achieved, Dr. Hisato tested various rapid reheating methods. He would plunge the frozen, solid limbs into scalding water or hold them directly close to an open fire,
Which would cause massive trauma.
These extreme sudden temperature shifts inevitably resulted in severe gangrene, massive tissue necrosis, and the flesh literally rotting away to the exposed bone while the victim was kept alive for observation.
And weapons testing was equally methodical and completely stripped of humanity. Pingfang had an outdoor facility known as the Ananda Testing Grounds. Prisoners were transported to this frozen plain and tied tightly to wooden stakes.
And these weren't just random executions.
No, these stakes were not placed randomly. They were planted at very specific, mathematically calculated intervals in the ground, forming concentric circles around a central target area. The researchers would then detonate experimental shrapnel bombs, laced with anthrax or bubonic plague in the center.
The purpose was entirely observational. They needed to calculate the exact radius of infection.
Exactly. They were measuring the blast wave, the dispersion cloud of the bacteria, and observing the exact penetration patterns of the contaminated shrapnel into living human tissue at different distances.
And then what did they do?
After the detonation, the researchers, clad in heavy protective hazmat suits, would walk out among the bleeding, dying victims tied to the stakes. They were holding clipboards to record the immediate physiological results of the blast.
But this raises a horrifying reality that completely shatters the argument that this was purely for military strategy.
How so?
Much of what took place within Unit 731 had absolutely zero military application. It was driven by pure sadistic curiosity. It was the body violation factor operating without any oversight.
You mean the experiments that had nothing to do with weapons?
Yes. There were syphilis experiments involving forced sexual acts between infected and uninfected prisoners, directed by doctors under the threat of the victims being shot if they refused.
Unbelievable.
There were prisoners locked inside massive industrial centrifuges and spun at increasing speeds until they died, simply to see how much G-force the human body could withstand before catastrophic failure.
There were also the low-pressure hypobaric chambers. Researchers would seal a prisoner inside and systematically pump the oxygen out, mimicking the extreme altitudes of unpressurized aircraft.
Right.
They would observe through heavy glass windows as the victim's internal organs expanded and ruptured, noting the exact pressure at which their eyes burst from their skulls.
And there are documented, irrefutable accounts of experiments performed on pregnant women. These women were deliberately impregnated by the staff, infected with various diseases, and then vivisected at different stages of gestation.
So the doctors could observe the barrier transfer of pathogens from the mother to the developing fetus.
Exactly. We must state clearly, there were absolutely no documented survivors from inside the Pingfang facility. None.
Not a single one.
Once a human being's body was used up, as the official bureaucratic logs termed it, they were murdered by lethal injection or poison gas. Their remains were immediately incinerated in the facility's massive, constantly burning crematoria.
You have to understand that Pingfang was merely the research and development department. The horrors we just detailed were simply the laboratory phase for a much wider, devastating war on the civilian population.
Right, the field tests.
This brings us to the biological holocaust in China. Between 1940 and 1942, Unit 731 transitioned their findings from controlled lab tests to active, wide-scale field tests. Japanese aircraft began targeting densely populated Chinese cities, including Ningbo, Changde, and Guizhou.
And dropping biological weapons from an airplane presents a massive engineering problem.
It does. If you drop a standard explosive bomb packed with bacteria, the intense heat and violent concussive force of the detonation will instantly incinerate the biological payload. The bacteria will die before it ever reaches the target.
So how did they solve it?
Shiro Ishii's team had to invent a delivery system that wouldn't destroy the agent upon impact. After extensive trial and error, the solution they engineered was the UG-type porcelain bomb.
Porcelain, like a fragile vase.
Exactly. These bomb casings were manufactured from thick porcelain. They were aerodynamically designed to fall accurately, but structured to shatter easily upon hitting the ground or a building.
Right, so no explosion.
Instead of a massive explosion, the bomb would simply break apart upon impact, releasing tens of thousands of plague-infected fleas and contaminated materials directly into the streets and waterways without generating the explosive heat that would neutralize the bacteria.
The resulting mass civilian casualties from these field tests constitute a biological holocaust. These were not small, contained outbreaks.
No, they devastated entire regions.
These localized epidemics, caused by the airdropped porcelain bombs and the deliberate manual contamination of municipal water sources and agricultural fields by Japanese troops, resulted in an estimated 200,000 to 500,000 Chinese civilian deaths.
Imagine the sheer terror of that reality. You are a civilian in Changde. There's an air raid siren, but instead of the concussive destruction of high explosives, small porcelain bombs shatter in the streets.
Just pieces of clay.
And a few days later, your neighbors begin dying of bubonic plague, a terrifying disease straight out of the Middle Ages, suddenly weaponized, optimized in a laboratory, and dropped from modern aircraft.
And we are not dealing with historical speculation or unverified wartime rumors here. The newly declassified 2025 Soviet archives, alongside the detailed, signed confessions of senior Japanese officers, provide ironclad, undeniable evidence.
The paperwork is all there.
Men like Kiyoshi Kawashima, the former head of Unit 731's Bacterial Production Department, and Hideo Sato explicitly detailed these operations. Kawashima's interrogation records confirm the precise monthly production quantities of biological weapons at Pingfang.
Right. And they meticulously detailed the large-scale logistical deployment of these weapons on Chinese cities. These 2025 archives prove unequivocally that this germ warfare was a premeditated, organized, top-down state crime.
It was fully funded and ordered by the highest levels of the imperial government. It was national policy.
It was.
Having tested these bioweapons on the Chinese populace, Unit 731 looked across the Pacific. As the war decisively turned against the Japanese Empire in early 1945, absolute desperation set in among the high command.
They knew they were losing.
This desperation birthed the 1945 Master Plan, officially finalized in March of that year. The operation was classified as Operation PX, or more poetically, Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night.
A beautiful name for something so horrific.
The target was the United States West Coast, specifically the densely populated cities of San Diego, Los Angeles, and San Francisco.
The mechanics of Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night represent the ultimate apocalyptic escalation of Shiro Ishii's vision. To strike the American mainland, the method relied on a fleet of 5 massive I-400-class submarine aircraft carriers. These submarines were unprecedented technological marvels for their time. They were massive underwater vessels specifically engineered to house, transport, and launch aircraft.
They actually carried planes inside them.
Yes, they carried Aichi M6A Saran floatplanes inside watertight hangars built directly onto the deck of the submarine.
The mission was explicitly and openly designed as a kamikaze operation. The plan was for the 5 submarines to cross the Pacific undetected, surface near the California coast under the cover of darkness, and launch the floatplanes.
And then what?
The pilots were ordered to drop balloon bombs loaded with millions of plague-infected fleas directly over these major civilian population centers. And then, to ensure maximum biological contamination, they were to crash their infected planes directly into the cities.
The pilots and the submarine crews were fully briefed that this was a one-way trip. The submarines themselves were to be scuttled after the launch to avoid capture. And the crews intended to deliberately infect themselves with the pathogens and run ashore, acting as human biological vectors if necessary. But the plan was halted at the 11th hour. General Yoshijiro Umezu, the chief of the Army General Staff, ultimately vetoed the attack.
And he didn't veto it out of a sudden surge of moral clarity or compassion for American civilians.
No, definitely not.
He vetoed it because he realized that launching a biological attack of that scale on the United States mainland would trigger what he called an endless battle of humanity against bacteria.
He knew it would earn Japan the absolute derision of the entire world.
And likely invite a retaliatory strike of unimaginable proportions from the Allies. But look at the timeline. The mission was officially scheduled for September 22, 1945.
Wow.
The United States West Coast was spared from this biological terror only because of Japan's unconditional surrender in August following the atomic bombings.
If a massive, complex logistical operation of this magnitude was finalized, and elite personnel were actively prepped and willing to execute suicide missions across the Pacific, what does that reveal about the command structure in Tokyo?
It's pure fanaticism.
It shows a government willing to risk global, uncontrollable biological annihilation to stave off a conventional military defeat. The ethos of Unit 731 had not just infected the doctors at Pingfang, it had thoroughly infected the strategic thinking of the highest echelons of the empire.
The war ended in August 1945, but the profound injustice of Unit 731 was just beginning. We have to look at what happens when victorious nations, positioning themselves as moral arbiters, decide to value military data over human justice.
Right.
The final days of Unit 731 were a frantic, highly coordinated exercise in erasing history. As the Soviet Red Army rapidly advanced into Manchuria, direct orders came down from Tokyo to completely destroy the Pingfang facility.
The execution of those orders was swift and brutal. The remaining prisoners, the Marutas still held in the cells, were immediately gassed or poisoned.
They couldn't leave any witnesses.
Exactly. The massive laboratories, the culture tanks, the incinerators, the 150 buildings were rigged with explosives and blown up to destroy the architectural evidence.
And Ishii.
Shiro Ishii ordered his men to return to Japan, blend into the civilian population, and take the secret of Pingfang to their graves. Ishii himself even faked his own death, complete with a staged funeral in his hometown to throw off Allied investigators.
But the American occupying forces, led by General Douglas MacArthur, were not fooled. They quickly realized, through intelligence gathering and interrogations, exactly what had been happening in Manchuria.
They knew the scale of it.
MacArthur assigned specialized investigators to track down the Japanese scientists. One of the key figures was bacteriologist Lieutenant Colonel Murray Sanders, operating out of Fort Detrick, the center of the U.S. biological weapons program.
Fort Detrick. That's crucial.
What followed between Sanders, MacArthur's command, and Shiro Ishii's network was a secret, calculated arrangement that mirrors Operation Paperclip in Germany, but with even darker ethical implications.
The negotiations were entirely transactional. The U.S. military realized that Ishii and his top scientists possessed years of irreplaceable, highly organized data on biological warfare.
Right. Data that couldn't be replicated legally anywhere else?
This was data on human survivability, pathogen dispersion, and weaponized delivery systems. Data derived entirely from the systematic murder of thousands of human beings.
And the U.S. wanted it.
In exchange for exclusive, complete access to this archive of horrors, General MacArthur and the U.S. government granted Shiro Ishii and his network of scientists full political and legal immunity from war crimes prosecution.
This is the grand betrayal. It represents a total hypocritical ethical collapse by the United States government. Contrast this directly with the Nuremberg trials.
Right.
The U.S. sat on tribunals and rightfully prosecuted, convicted, and executed Nazi doctors for the abhorrent crime of human experimentation. They established the Nuremberg Code to dictate global medical ethics.
And yet simultaneously,
The U.S. actively suppressed the staggering evidence of Unit 731. They hid the truth from the global public and, most importantly, from their own ally, the Soviet Union, to keep the biological data out of Soviet hands as the Cold War began to take shape.
the U.S. government didn't just grant them immunity, they literally paid them. Investigators handed over envelopes of cash as financial stipends to these perpetrators to secure their cooperation.
To ensure the data was translated.
Exactly, to ensure that data was accurately translated and integrated into the American Biological Weapons Program at Fort Detrick. You have to realize, much of the foundational data modern militaries possess regarding human tolerance to extreme temperatures or the dispersion rates of specific biological agents, data that might literally be referenced in defense textbooks right now, was paid for in the blood of the victims at Pingfang.
The Soviet Union, having captured some of the researchers who failed to escape Manchuria, held their own tribunals. During the Khabarovsk trials in 1949, 12 members of Unit 731 were presented with overwhelming evidence, confessed, and were convicted of manufacturing biological weapons and conducting inhumane experiments.
So the Soviets knew.
They did. Yet because of the immunity deal, the United States and Western powers dismissed these proceedings entirely. They actively lobbied the international press to label the trials as mere communist propaganda, deliberately deflecting global attention from the truth to protect their newly acquired assets.
The aftermath of this deal is deeply unsettling. Because they were shielded by the most powerful military in the world, the perpetrators of Unit 731 returned to Japan and faced zero consequences.
In fact, they thrived.
They leveraged their unpunished crimes into highly successful, prestigious post-war lives. Masaji Kitano, who served as the second commander of Unit 731 and directly oversaw horrifying experiments, became the director of the Green Cross Corporation, a major, highly profitable Japanese pharmaceutical company.
Dr. Yoshimura Hisato, the man who deliberately froze the limbs of prisoners and children to calculate tissue necrosis, suffered no loss of status. He became a respected, widely published university professor and eventually served as the president of the Japanese Medical Society.
And Shiro Ishii, the architect of this industrial slaughter. He was never brought before a tribunal. He lived peacefully in Japan, occasionally consulting for the Americans, and died of throat cancer in his bed in 1959.
It is a profound miscarriage of justice.
To summarize this deeply somber timeline, we have traced the terrifying trajectory of Unit 731. It began as a strategic theory capitalizing on a legal loophole, envisioned by Shiro Ishii.
Right.
It expanded into the construction of a massive, state-sponsored slaughterhouse in Pingfang, Manchuria, facilitated by the abductions of the Kempeitai. We have documented the mechanical efficiency and the psychological compartmentalization with which doctors reduced human beings to logs, systematically vivisecting them and subjecting them to lethal pathogens and extreme temperatures.
And we saw this terror exported from the laboratory to the skies over Chinese cities via porcelain bombs, causing hundreds of thousands of agonizing civilian deaths.
We analyzed the finalized Operation Cherry Blossoms at night, a plan to bring that same biological devastation to the American West Coast. Finally, we witnessed a global cover-up orchestrated by the United States, an immunity deal that traded human justice for military advantage, keeping Unit 731 a closely guarded state secret for decades.
Reflecting on this history requires us to acknowledge the ongoing modern fight for recognition. The truth could not be buried forever.
Decades of relentless activism by survivors' families, dedicated international historians, and whistleblowers have slowly forced this history into the light, fighting against intense historical revisionism.
In 2002, a Tokyo district court finally issued a landmark ruling. For the first time, it legally acknowledged that the Japanese military had indeed conducted biological warfare and human experimentation in China.
That was a huge step.
However, in a devastating blow, the court denied the victims and their families any financial compensation, relying on strict legal technicalities regarding post-war treaties.
But the physical reality of the site can no longer be hidden. Today, the former site of the Pingfang headquarters in Harbin has been preserved and reopened as the Museum of Evidence of War Crimes by Japanese Army Unit 731.
The museum's striking architecture is deliberately designed to resemble the black box of a crashed airplane. It serves as a solemn, unyielding repository for the darkest, most irrecoverable records of humanity.
And the recent 2025 release of the fully declassified Soviet interrogation archives from the Khabarovsk trials has finally solidified the complete chain of evidence, definitively stripping away the last veils of denial utilized by those who wish to minimize this history.
We want to leave you with a heavy, lingering question to mull over. It is a question that strikes at the very core of modern science, ethics, and military intelligence.
What is that question?
If the medical and military knowledge we possess today, the hard data housed in our national archives, defense institutions, and perhaps even some medical textbooks, was born from extreme industrialized atrocities that went entirely unpunished, can that data ever be ethically separated from the horror used to acquire it?
Does the continuous utilization of that knowledge by modern nations implicitly validate the cover-up, the immunity deals, and the ultimate betrayal of those thousands of victims?
It's something you have to sit with.
You are looking at a history where the firewall of medicine was dismantled by the state, where the doctors became the disease. The resulting picture is not one of healing, but of infinite mechanical darkness. It is an image we must force ourselves to look at, study, and remember, no matter how much we wish to look away.